I want to start off the conversation with some grounding in this topic from your respective scholarship, and as a way for the audience here to get to know each of you a little bit as scholars. So Dr. Spencer, could you start off by sharing a bit about what you've learned from your decades of research building out the P-Vest theory about how young people take in information as they navigate the world and make sense of the context around them, and what this means for young people learning about the racism and white supremacy in all aspects and systems in our society?
What I am most concerned about is that, and yes, in decades of doing this work, there is still a proclivity not to recognize the baseline humanity and what that means for kids of color. And what I would start off by saying is that very often in our science, even though we don't acknowledge it, and I don't think everyone's aware of it, we choose topics that very often focus on outcomes for children of color and for poor children. And we look at human developmental processes for privileged children and for white children. And that means then that in terms of the context, which has not changed basically or significantly in 400 years, it means then that if you're comparing whites and blacks or poor kids and the more established privileged kids, it means then that the outcomes are going to be the responses of humans to the nature of the context. And if the context is problematic, therefore you're going to find differences, which will get you one more publication, but will not contribute to what we know about how humans develop an interaction with context. And for me, one of the most significant and important constructs to help us with looking at everyone's developmental processes is looking at how kids become aware of the outside world. All humans take part in that process, but being able to engage in that process with the context and the information that we take in and the feedback in terms of what that information means in terms of attitudes, beliefs, etc. It matters because very often they're not challenged and that they basically develop as kids develop and as the context changes. They give feedback that is consistent with their exposure to certain contexts. So that's a major and consistent problem. So we say that we're objective, but the pattern of question asking and comparisons made, very often for me at least, I think, perpetuates this pattern of looking at outcomes that you'll find differences. And therefore, they're used, thought about, disseminated as stereotypes about what certain kids can't do or not. And therefore, others who are not burdened by that contextual, if you will, um, process means then that they think everything they produce, it has to do with who they are in terms of their privilege and their superior placement in society, and not because the environment is conducive, if you will, and reinforcing of a view of self that is not called privilege, but it is privilege in terms of a hierarchy. And I'm probably close to my 4 minutes, but I may have 30 seconds left.
Yeah.
What I would say then is that when we are talking about the role of social cognition processes for some, and when they're not challenged in terms of uneven access to resources, it means then that the downside of privilege for me represents an inability to really be able to believe that one can compete. What we're looking at right now for this country, has to do with someone in terms of a person in power who only believes that, he's superior to others that he views as inferior, without acknowledging that there is a consonance between his experiences in the world and the resources that were available. But for other kids who are exposed to structured inequalities and inequities, it means in essence there's always a dissonance. There's always uncomfortableness that one experiences as you navigate space and time and deal with the same developmental tasks that others were trying to navigate as well and acquire but without the same supports, but worse, with a sense of dissonance in terms of the self and therefore socio-emotional functioning that has implications for the cognitive products produced as well.
Thank you. Dr. Rogers, can you talk to us about the implications of growing up in the societal context that Dr. Spencer's been speaking about? Why is identity development so important? How does it relate to learning and thriving? And what have you learned about how growing up in this context of racism and white supremacy affects young people's identity development?
Yeah, so I study identity, and I just want to first of all underscore, as Dr. Spencer was saying, the universality of these constructs, right? That these are human processes that are nested within context. And so all of us are engaged in this question of who am I? Who can I become? What are my possibilities? But we're going to answer that question and have to navigate that question in different ways based on the context and resources, challenges, and obstacles that are presented to us. And so one of the reasons that the societal context is so essential to identity is because our identities are shaped by our context, right? So who I am is deeply connected with who you are, and it's deeply connected with the messages I'm getting from society. Okay, so in the research that I do with young people, and this is young people across school settings, racial diverse backgrounds, in all boys schools and all girls schools, so thinking about young people in different settings and contexts, and talking about different aspects of their identity, it's become very clear that when you ask kids about who they are and how they understand what's possible for them, these narratives of racism and discrimination at the intersection of race and gender and sexuality and social class and so on are interwoven into their own stories. Yes, you can ask young people about a direct experience of discrimination or exclusion, and you can get those stories as well. But what's really compelling is that when you ask them, what does it mean to be Black, or what does it mean to be a girl, or what's hard about being a Black boy at this school, they also tell you stories about racism and discrimination and sexism and homophobia, right? So just underscoring that these big macro issues are not way out in the society somewhere, but they're intimately connected in terms of how young people are experiencing their everyday, how they're making sense of who they are, and how they're figuring out what their place is, right? You ask a white girl, what does it mean to be a white girl? And they tell you a story about how the teachers trust them more than the other kids. You know, if I wasn't a white girl, I don't think the teacher would trust me the way she does, right? What does it mean to be a Black boy? Well, Black boys are made for sports. That's what people think, right? These are very intimate narratives that kids are getting from society about who they can become. And what we're noticing in particular that I think is important and compelling is not just that kids know these stereotypes, but they actively engage them, and more critically, they resist and challenge them, right? So they take those narratives, it's not this sort of passive acceptance, but they're aware and they're responding and rejecting to say, you know, that's not who I am. That's not who I'm going to become. And so I think when we think about how society is shaping the experiences of young people and how they thrive in school or other settings, we have to take seriously, as Dr. Spencer was saying, the sorts of obstacles that they're navigating. What narratives are young people having to challenge and prove wrong and negotiate? And then what's that experience look like for young people who don't have, right, those same negative narratives coming down on them? So yeah, we can look at outcomes in a particular population and say, oh, these kids all aspire to be doctors and these kids don't. And we can also look at the context and the kinds of messages young people are negotiating through. And so I think that sort of awareness that the macro system and these big processes of inequality are recognized and experienced for young people, that they're working to resist and challenge them. So then the question becomes, what's our role as allies, as educators, as parents, to support young people and to do our work to disrupt those narratives so they don't have to.
Great. Dr. Gray, what are some of the lessons from your research about how the racism and white supremacy young people experience in the education system in particular affects their sense of belonging and the quality of their learning in those spaces?
Thank you, Lisa, for the question. My friends and I, we do research together on belonging. We're finding that a lack of acceptance, respect, inclusion, and support are structural barriers, but they can be lifted to honor and affirm students from historically marginalized backgrounds and make school a place where they want to be and want to learn. So these opportunities, in responding from a place of love and optimism, I would say that these opportunities can be actively created by educators, teachers, et cetera. But they can be actively created in ways that address the vulnerabilities that students of color face in school settings around belonging. And so when we typically think about belonging, we might think of it from an interpersonal perspective, which is important to think about the bonds that you create, the way you're treated inside of a school building as well. But there's also some other elements that teachers and educators can step in on as well. One is an instructional opportunity structure, where a student can understand the connection or experience a sense of continuity or belonging with their ancestral heritage or with their community through what they learn in school. And if we don't talk about curriculum and instruction, we're losing out on an opportunity to really like address the Eurocentric platform that schools are built on, right? It's baked into schools. The second thing that we want to talk about though is institutional opportunity structures, when we start to think about students as human beings with rights. If we're thinking about preparing them for society and being full citizens with rights tomorrow, where does that voice start? It starts now inside of the school building when they, are engaged with adults and asked about their perspective and seeing their decisions being reflected in how schools are run.
Great. Thank you. So turn to our second topic here. This webinar is about equipping leaders in youth serving systems with key insights from research that they need to advance change in the systems that they lead and the systems that they influence. So this means both using what we know from science to inform people and inform the design of policies and practices. So I'm going to address this next question to all three of you. What is one key insight from research that if leaders in youth serving systems understood might drive them to make different decisions in their work? So this could be something that decision makers aren't often aware of or something that's often misunderstood. So let's go in this order. Dr. Quay, we'll go back to you first, and then Dr. Rogers and Dr. Spencer.
Well, I would encourage leaders to think deeply, critically, and just take a second glance, at this idea of engagement and what it might represent. So if a student is in a system that is not intended for them, was never intended for them in the first place, and they reject what is put in front of them, what does their disengagement represent? If we ask the question, how can we get students more engaged without, understanding and appreciating what their disengagement is telling us about the environment, we're missing the big picture, right? So as we think about culture, as we think about creating school environments that are attuned to students' needs, both developmentally and culturally and motivationally, we also need to think about, thinking about their engagement as a vote of confidence, around the way schools are structured, right? And so if we restructure our thinking and not thinking about disengagement as maladaptive, but instead, thinking about students having good reasons for being disengaged inside of schools, we can then, start to disrupt the structures that are in place and design schools based on cultural interpretations of fit that connect with students better and make it a place where they have, there's no better option than to immerse themselves deeply into the content, the environment, and learn what is to be learned in that setting.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to pick up right where you're leaving off, Dr. Gray, and saying, I would say one of the key findings is basically like a return, if you will, to the recognition of our relational nature as human beings. And what young people need and crave most, what all of us need and crave most, is to feel that sense of belonging, to feel connected, to feel supported, to feel cared about, to feel seen, right? And what we hear in young people talking about their identities, these are not sort of individualistic isolated sense of self. This is like, who am I and how am I seen and how am I connected? And what we hear is that the stereotypes and those negative narratives are the things that disrupt those relationships, that make it impossible for us to feel connected and in community. And that's a fundamental need. And related to that, and this goes to what Dr. Spencer said earlier, I think increasingly we see and we're recognizing that all of the attention tends to be on oppression, but oppression and privilege are two sides of the same coin. And so, and both of them are equally problematic, right? So we focus a lot on the oppression side and too often forget about privilege. So just as Black kids are learning and pushing to resist stereotypes, right, that frame them as inferior, white kids need to learn how to resist and reject narratives that position them as superior, right? And so recognizing that, again, that relational piece of who we are, as well as the relational piece of these identities, and that privilege and oppression both need to be addressed equally in the way that we frame equity in our work.
Along the same lines, I really appreciate both Dr. Gray's comments and Dr. Rogers as well. But the thing that I would like to make sure that our educators and our providers remember is the shared status of human vulnerability, and therefore in interactions with our young people, to look for their strengths, to look for their sources of support to be reinforced, and not to make the assumption, that they only have risks and challenges and they're less than. And so my first thing I would say to all people responsible for other people's children is that, number one, we have to acknowledge that our own human vulnerability, as well as its equal distribution among all humans. And so for me, human vulnerability means then a balance or imbalance between the supports that are available or the versus the risks and challenges. And so as the context for youth's development, we need to see ourselves in terms of our human vulnerability as contributing to the supports of other youngsters. And if we don't engage in self-interrogation, we don't question the variety, if you will, of messages and that we provide that function either as sources of support for some and reaffirmation of their humanity, and sources of risk and challenge for others. So that's the first thing I would say, is that human vulnerability is shared. No one has a corner on it. We all have it, but the corner is in the context. The differences are in the context. And so we can either serve as a source of someone else's support, our youngsters' supports, or continued in our unself-interrogated manner to function as sources of challenge and risk. I think that insight alone is so important because it makes us question our role as the context for learning and development for other people's children. So that self-interrogation process, I believe, is really key as a first step. The other comment I wanted to make, because Dr. Rogers has done a wonderful job as well talking about identity, is to remind us again in our role as a context of support that identity is also linked to our human biology, that self processes in those first half dozen years is fundamentally different than from the period of middle childhood and adolescence. So mainly because of the cognitive changes. So in the first 6 years or so, what kids are like in terms of sense of self is what they're exposed to, because there is an unquestioning, I call it that social egocentrism, and that is the kids moving out of this self-centered way of being to one that is relational, as Dr. Rogers mentioned. But that is a process, right? So kids, when they're young children can have a secure sense of self because that's the feedback from the context. But with changes in their cognitive functioning, they're able to take the point of view of other people and apply that to the self, potentially, unless we understand our role in providing, if you will, positive models and messages. And those models and messages are powerful, and we must take responsibility for them. And too often that is not what we're engaged in because we have not engaged in the self-interrogation process. And without that, I think we have the potential to do harm.
Thank you. So I'm going to pick up on some themes that have come up already in our conversation, and particularly some points you raised earlier, Dr. Spencer. So this audience cares deeply about grounding their work in science. That's why they're on this webinar today. And as I mentioned at the top of our conversation, there's a real reckoning that needs to happen about the role of science in both reflecting and perpetuating racism and white supremacy in our society and in our youth serving systems. So you all are scholars who do research that reflects young people's humanity and their assets. And there are so many other researchers who are building our collective scientific knowledge base in this way. Scholars whose work often gets marginalized while others' work gets elevated because of systemic racism and white supremacy in the academy and the structures of the academy. So what do leaders looking to ground their decisions in high quality, equity-centered, asset-based research need to know and look for in the science and the researchers that they're tapping to inform these kinds of anti-racist changes to policy and practice? And what can we all do to encourage and support this kind of scholarship? So I'm going to ask each of you to speak to different angles of this very broad topic. Dr. Spencer, to build our collective understanding here, could you give an example of how research in psychology has perpetuated racist narratives and practices that uphold white supremacy in youth serving systems?
I think too often researchers are not comfortable in acknowledging what they don't know. And very often what they don't know is the process of normal human development in communities that they have no knowledge of. So pretending that you know about children because you're a psychologist, but you have no experience in that community. As Dr. Gray said earlier, one misinterprets behavior to mean something else. And for example, thinking about disengagement as maladaptive coping, when in fact, given the context and this potential heinous character, disengagement from a mental health perspective might be a good thing. I mean, so we're not always clear about constructs that we use. That constructs might mean something very different in different communities where the contextual experiences are different. That's one thing. Basically using allies or becoming just simply more educated yourself about other people's communities. And don't assume from that hierarchical position of privilege, that you know everything about other people's children, because we don't. And that means, when you're going out and forming collaborations, you might be able to say that, oh yes, I'm working with people in the neighborhood community center. You might collaborate with them in terms of getting their support to get resources. But when it's time to interpret the data, you ignore them. Where if they were at the table as well with you, interpreting findings. In essence, if you're explaining what constructs to me, let me give you an example in terms of daily hassles. Daily hassles is an assessment tool that people have been using with adolescents for an awful long time. And so we realized that for some children, daily hassles may mean something very different. When kids report that their families, really, are heavy with them in terms of hassles. For Black kids, as Dr. Dr. Gray, referred to in terms of misconstrual of constructs, for kids of color living in very under-resourced neighborhoods, that hassles means for youngsters that their parents are really monitoring them. So heavy monitoring is a good thing. But for kids from particular environments that don't have daily, if you will, risk experiences as far as their context, parental hassles means something very different. So we're able to show that parental monitoring using a hassles assessment tool for it really was a protective for youngsters, for kids who knew that their parents were, really, in essence, hassling them. They understood it's because parents were trying to protect them. So from a data interpretation perspective, the same construct means something very different depending upon their everyday experiences and how they need to cope in certain under-resourced environments. In other words, even though you think you are a developmental scientist and you know about development, you may know about development for kids who look like you and are privileged, but you do not know what coping looks like for families and individuals who have to live in structured, if you will, conditions of inequality in terms of low resource and support, and the fact that police officers who are paid with public dollars to provide supports, in fact, do not function as a source of support for individuals like you, either in school or out school, out in the community as you're trying to navigate to school. So my point here is that constructs mean different things potentially for different communities, and we need to make sure that we're clear about that before we engage in their use across the board.
Right, thank you. Dr. Rogers, in our prep conversation, you noted that science isn't neutral and we need to put humanity back into science. This is important for research, both to advance an accurate understanding of learning and development and to do so in service of benefiting young people who have often been marginalized in both science and the systems in our society. So can you give us a specific example of where you've seen this kind of humanized science and what can it look like?
Yeah, so I think I just want to broaden a little bit to say that in terms of humanizing research, it's an approach more than a specific study design or question or even research sample. So, in terms of as you're looking at research and how, whether you think it's good quality research and how to use it, I say watch for buzzwords, right? Like when, equity and diversity and culture, but they don't ever really define them, or you don't ever name racism, right? Like diversity and racism are not the same thing. So being mindful of sort of how terminology is even being used in literature and in research, that tells you a lot about sort of the positionality of it. And then related to that, which is right on par with what Dr. Spencer was talking about, is how are the results interpreted? Where are the conclusions nested in individuals? That's a no, right? Like we do not live as isolated beings. We are always embedded in context. So how is context being invoked here? How are we thinking about positionality? How do we think about what this means in this context, right? This kid's doing this. Well, let's look at the around to understand, right? If interpretations are coming back to an individual level explanation, that's probably going to be very problematic because that's not how humans work. That's not how we live. That's not how we grow. That's not how we thrive. And in terms of like approaching science, so Alicia Ali has a beautiful piece called Humanizing the Scientific Method. It's in Naomi Wei's edited book called The Crisis of Connection, which just came out last year. And the core idea is that scientists have to recognize, to Dr. Spencer's point, our humanity. So we have this script in our heads, not just in our heads, but an intentional script that elevates scientists, right, as the knowers, and that they have some ridiculous capacity to be objective and disconnected from the phenomena that we're observing. And that's just not true, right? Like, what does it look like to put our humanity back into the science? Right. And so that means recognizing that we are humans, that we have vulnerabilities, that we have positionalities, that we have perspectives. That's all part of it. And the intent of science is not to remove it, but to acknowledge it and see how it gets threaded into our scholarship, to question, to bring in a more complex and diverse set of perspectives, to get closer to what feels like a truth, right, in a given setting or context. And so 3 pillars that Dr. Ali outlines in that chapter that I just want to highlight. The one is unothering participants, right? So our participants are not subjects. They're not people that we are, observing and studying, and they're not passive, right? And this goes to Dr. Spencer's point as well, which is, community partnership doesn't stop at give me access to your population, right? These are not passive subjects that we get to study and teach, but we get to learn from, right? They're experts in their own right. They have knowledge and insight that are essential to the questions that we claim we want to know and understand. And then the second one being humanizing the scientists, right? Recognizing our biases. And then the last one, contextualizing oppression. So recognizing again, right, that we are in a state of oppression. That is the context in which we live. And so from that position, the questions look different, the interpretations look different, right? In studying how kids understand race, you know, sometimes the conversation seems to orbit around like, are kids born racist or do they learn to be racist? Like, and I often say that's the wrong question. Mm-hmm. The question is, we live in a racist society. So what does it mean for children to grow up and figure out who they are in the context of a racist society? How are they going about that, right? So recognizing that oppression is in the context, and that has to be therefore part of our research. And so then there are important methods for sure that are out there that lend themselves to doing this work. So community-based design, participant-led, community-engaged, participatory action research, those sort of models and approaches. But again, I would just underscore that it's more of a perspective and set of belief systems about knowledge and knowledge construction and about your own humanity that matters more than the particular method or design of the study.
Thank you. Dr. Gray, I know from personal experience that you have an encyclopedic knowledge of the scientific literature. When you think about the cutting edge research practice here, what are things decision makers in youth serving systems should be looking for and taking a critical eye to the scholarship and the scholars that they're tapping as part of anti-racist efforts in those systems? And what can they do to demand and encourage and support this kind of research? I think this builds on the points from both Dr. Rogers and Dr. Spencer here.
It sure does. And I like to break up the question into two parts. One is, you know, if we're talking about what can they be looking for, you know, both in terms of what they're reading, but also in conversations with these scholars, I think a couple of things come to mind. The first is, you know, are they elevating methods, approaches, and philosophies that shed light on cultural blind spots that might masquerade as objective perspectives on learning and human development? Another one that comes to mind is, can they situate the importance of their scholarship on historically marginalized populations within a historical context or a larger contextual backdrop of American society, right? There's a history to this work. And, you know, even in psychology, I mean, we might study, you know, things that are happening in the minds of the students that we study, but, you know, it's structural, you know, so, and historical. A third thought that I had is, you know, if the researchers themselves are not members of an historically marginalized identity group, then are they able to share how scholars who are from these groups have contributed to their thinking, you know, both in terms of rigor and authenticity of the work? And I think a fourth that I would say is, regardless of you know, who they are, I think there should be a record of commitment to equity-focused issues in their service, outreach, or leadership activities. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, you can learn different methods and how to, you know, do different research approaches, but, you know, we just can't teach you, you know, easily how to care about our Black and brown babies. You know, the stakes are too high. So we have to have people who care off the break. And the second piece to the question was around, I interpret it in terms of partnership. So I would say the biggest thing that we're missing when we try to partner or tap scholars is we don't give ourselves enough time, right, to understand and appreciate the context of the partnership sometimes. Because, you know, there are deliverables that need to happen. There might be funding attached to the initiative that is supposed to, you know, keep us on a timeline. But sometimes that lack of appreciation for context also comes from the community partners themselves, and it's not just the scholars. And so without making that time, we fail to really like afford ourselves what we need to have contextual insights. And the second piece is around negotiating voice, right? So if you're a stakeholder working with the scholar, how do you negotiate your voice throughout all aspects of the partnership? And Dr. Spencer was mentioning this, you know, from what researchers do and don't do. But on the partner side, you know, you're the gatekeeper to the students, to the data, you know, so you got to hold the candle to that as you know, partner with these stakeholders. You want to negotiate roles and make sure that your voice is elevated at these different elements of the project, including outreach and dissemination, because you're an idea generator and you deserve credit too for your insights that you contribute to this academic enterprise.
Thank you all. I could talk about that for like hours. So I appreciate the conversation we just started here on that topic. Thank you. So in our last topic, and then we're going to turn it to audience Q&A here, but in preparing for this conversation today, we talked about the natural curiosity and engagement of young people and how racism and white supremacy in our youth serving systems actively harms and does violence to this curiosity and engagement. Can you each give one example of the ways in which racism and white supremacy shows up in education policies and practices and the impact that that has on young people? And what kind of approaches does research suggest we need to be considering in addressing and repairing that harm? So let's go in this order. Dr. Rogers, will start with you, and then Dr. Spencer and Dr. Gray.
Okay, so I think that the thing I brought up in our conversation, and I'll come back to, and it builds on what Dr. Gray was speaking about earlier, which is the metrics that we use for measuring success or well-being or competency. Those are not neutral, right? And so, right, our sort of emphasis on grades and achievement and performance and these outcome markers that I know, right, there's a lot of weight put into these, and this is what funders want, or this is what certain folks need to show effect. But what we miss in doing that is that ignores the ways in which the very constructs that we're using to measure success are themselves part of the system of inequality, right? So when a young person, right, disengages from schooling, that's a problem that's seen as negative, and it's seen as a problem of the child and not of the context or the setting, right? So these individual level measures of success, which is engagement or achievement, are seen as problems with the kid, and then we focus on how do we get these kids re-engaged in this classroom. It's like, well, if that classroom actually is embedded in a bunch of racist practices, I don't want them engaged in that classroom. I want them to disengage and to protect, right? But our sort of framing of what is good and competent doesn't really account for that reality. So how do we shift the context so natural curiosity can thrive? It also just reinforces our values of society, right? That like the kinds of things we really put weight on, underscores the ways in which we are committed to a narrative of individualism and monetary success. And right, we're not measuring how well you get along with each other and take care of each other, right? And even how well kids are attuned to injustice and unfairness in the classroom or with their peers, right? We're not paying attention to those things in the same way. We might call them the non-cognitive skills. What kind of social and emotional non-cognitive skills do kids have? But we don't take them seriously. And so that also just sort of underscores what is successful, what successful means in this setting and context. And that is part of the problem, I would say. And so part of the repair, I would say, is broadening our scope of what it means to be human. What sort of things can we value in the scope of humanity? And as educators and leaders, ask yourself, what questions would I ask about my own kids, right? So these aren't other people's children. These aren't something else. These are indeed, right, this sort of collective humanity. How do we recognize like what I need most for my kid is the kinds of things we need for other kids. And I'll just end with a short example from a school principal that I was working with. And I asked her a question about the quality of the school and what she was, how she was feeling about it. And she just said, you know, I cry because I'm running a school right now that I wouldn't send my child to. And that's not okay. And unfortunately, too many, as Dr. Gray said, educators, teachers, principals, parents are okay running schools and teaching classrooms that they would never send their own children to. And that cannot be okay.
To follow up on Dr. Rogers' point, for me, I think to accomplish some of these goals, we have to address the problem of a lack of equity in resource distribution. To basically right some of the wrongs in terms of the character of teacher training even the HR process of who gets hired. You know, it's a resource distribution issue. The training, having more time for training in terms of helping people to think about human development that is inclusive of kids of color. We don't think about their human development, we think about their outcomes. I mentioned that before, but I cannot begin to tell you how important that is. Uh, in essence, lack of equity and resource distribution also means then that we need to have resources to engage in more innovative programming. From given Dr. Rogers' focus on identity, but I would say the step before identity, given the context, is coping. So coping with these unequal conditions means then that there are ways of coping or responding to these conditions that in some cases means then that kids develop coping strategies that may be productive getting from home to school, but may not be productive in school, or being exposed to lots of stereotypes concerning what you can't learn. And let's face it, you know, for the women out here in the audience as well, you know how often growing up you heard that math and science is not what women can do well. Well, just multiply that by, you know, 100 at least, and you'll be aware of all the messages that certain kids get in terms of what they can't do and what they can't learn, which means then to offset those messages, we're going to have to, you know, engage in very creative programming and innovations. To give you an example, in terms of our own work, we were doing a project in 2 states with high school students. We were trying to reinforce school engagement and high performance. So we recruited adolescents who were AB students and students who were CD students, and all were students who basically were growing up in households which were below the poverty line. How did we know that for sure? And we didn't depend upon these schools' designation as a free lunch school, and therefore it was assumed to be homogeneous, right? And that all kids there were above or below the poverty line. Instead, we ended up getting documentation from the home. What we found in terms of AB students who were doing well, we said, you're doing well, we'll just give you a monthly stipend because these kids were from poor households. And if money is an issue, especially for adolescents, you don't want them worrying about money. You want them worrying about maintaining good grades and learning. So we gave those kids a monthly stipend and told them you maintain your AB status and you'll keep getting a monthly stipend to help you function with the tasks of adolescents that are very often, you know, requiring resources that parents don't always have. For the CD students, we also gave them a stipend, but we told them that they would be required to engage in after-school programming in order to become, if you will, acquire, as Dr. Rogers mentioned, a new identity, a new engagement to school. So we taught these kids to be basically health educators for their families and for the community. And we found that with the incentive, a relevant, authentic incentive for adolescents, monetary incentives, that these kids, not only did they maintain, but some of them became, if you will, AB students. And they were going off into four-year colleges, et cetera. So therefore, we need resources to be creative in the, if you will, reversal of maladaptive coping, which Dr. Rogers said, and Dr. Gray as well. They can be adaptive to the conditions. You need resources for that. So for me, a major issue is a more equitable distribution of resources to be used as supportive coping devices that make sense, given 400 years in this country of dehumanization.
Well, just building on some of these comments, I think I'll just add to this conversation by emphasizing the importance of action projects. The reason why I say that is because we can be very adultist in how we run school environments or learning contexts. And so action projects, you know, naturally put the power back in students' hands when we have the tendency to inadvertently strip them of their agency, which is ideally not what we want to do. So prior scholarship demonstrates a few ways that this can happen, or a few critical levers. One lever is around a vision, that, is very specific yet far reaching in terms of, what the action projects or advocacy efforts can add up to. Another one is around leadership stability on projects, on teams, in after school environments where students are doing this type of work. A third would be about more sophisticated long-term like structure for funding. And it, doesn't all come from outside entities either. Some of it is funded by the school district to, make sure that there's a continuous stream of funding to support these innovative programs, because we don't want them to come and go, right? So we have to cost share. And last, I would say, intermediary organizations or outside groups can amplify things by providing a network to support the work. So when students are doing action work, it isn't contained within the school. It goes online. It goes to after school spaces. It goes to their school board. It goes to, different community organizations that they want to help, or it goes to the polls and they actually sign students up to register to vote. So there are real ways that things can be amplified if outside organizations also chip in and support the effort to amplify the great things that some schools are already trying to do.
Great. All right, so we've got 4 minutes left. We're going to take one question that's related to a point, Dr. Spence, that you just brought up around after school related things. So this got a lot of interest in the chat box. What roles and responsibilities do informal learning settings have to help students understand the biases that are baked into formal schooling? How do we get formal schooling educators to understand the historic and current roles that these often culturally responsive and identity affirming organizations play? I'll open the floor to whoever would like to take that question.
Out of school contexts are huge for a couple of reasons. If we're talking about something related to equity focused, conversations, it allows the people who want to be there, so you can get more depth in those conversations. Teachers are also a little freer because they're not beholden to tests and other things that kind of weigh them down and keep them from covering the type of content that they feel might really matter to students. And the third thing that I would say is, in these environments, they're a little less structured. So when they don't feel like school, students are more likely to engage freely and really share their thoughts because they're not, being evaluated in the same way, and so it's all optional and it feels less like school. And the fourth, the bonus is, since things are online now, it broadens the reach and allows a lot more people to participate in these environments, particularly when they're not happening during the school day. So you can like engage with students across multiple school environments to really build a larger network and have a larger reach with these types of programs.
I agree with everything Dr. Gray has shared. But I would say as well, in terms of evaluating these programs, that you're real careful about the outcome that you're measuring, because otherwise, you might have the same problem in that the sources of resources are going to ask the question of impact. And if you're not in essence assessing the right outcome, then they're going to assume that doesn't make a difference. Or they might assume that something should happen overnight, when in fact we're talking about long-term coping processes that have to be, in essence, overcome. I can give you an example again of some of the work that we're doing. And this one is a culturally consonant program. We're using students' own interest in music. And music for communities have always served a purpose in terms of an adaptive coping strategy. So we're using students' interest in turntabling as linked to a standards determined curriculum to teach them STEM, because music is nothing but math and science. And if we were looking only for outcomes in terms of learning right away, we would perhaps be viewed as not, if you will, effective. But if you look at engagement, that students get engaged and they stay engaged, that's the first step to learning. So again, understanding something about human development is really important, because sometimes we choose an outcome which doesn't make sense. given where you are in the process. And that's for in school, after school, in school programming, community-based programming, or even programming that augments what's happening in school. You've got to make sure that you're measuring the right construct, and you will get pressure to assess at some point.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly that I'm also sort of struck by the question and framing of in school and out of school learning, right? That like human learning is human learning, and the fact that we have to define in and out of school just underscores the primacy and elevation that we have on formal education in this society, right? Like it already presumes that the certain kind of learning happens in this particular formal space. And then there's other kinds of learning we recognize, right? So even that, I think for, as you're asking, you know, what can teachers do? I think, you know, just disrupting that idea, like why do we think that what happens in my classroom is the most important thing for kids to learn? That's really preposterous. And if you look around the world, that's just not the way learning happens. And so the learning structure is fabricated. And so because of that fabricated structure, not to mention racist structure, it requires a lot of intentionality and gymnastics to get everybody engaged, because it's not genuine, right? So I think as teachers, it's important to recognize like we're in this structure, but what can we do in this space rather than feeling like the space itself is somehow elevated and the necessary site for kids to learn meaningful information.
May I add one point? Is it okay? I'll
10,
go very quickly.
15 seconds. Yeah,
Okay.
You get the last word, Dr. Spencer.
And that is why for me, you know, in essence, starting out with, in essence, theorizing about human development for diverse groups means then that, to Dr. Rogers' point, you know, context is always with us. You know, it's the context inside or outside, but it is still context and it matters.
Thank you. I couldn't think of a better way to end this. Thank you, Dr. Spencer. So just with that, I'll wrap us up. Thank you so much, Dr. Rogers, Dr. Spencer, Dr. Gray, for sharing your wealth of expertise. So grateful to all of you. Thank you to Sam Koba and Bethany Little and the entire Soul Alliance for hosting this important conversation and this webinar series. And thank you all for joining us. Grateful for all of you being here. Love it. And really just encourage you to attend the next webinar series. So thank you all and have a great weekend. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.